From the first moment they met, he knew she was the one. She was a pony of immeasurable beauty, beauty that made other mares scowl behind her back. She was a perfection of form and feature unrivaled by any work of art, a living sculpture given life by careless gods who knew not the strife their creation would sow. Her alabaster coat was smooth and flawless. An amethyst mane drifted absently between hues. Her slender horn tapered to an elegant point. She was, in a word, perfect. It was her beauty that caught the glassblower's eye, but not what caught his heart. He had seen beautiful ponies before. In Canterlot they were the rule, rather than the exception. And while he certainly had felt the tug of physical attraction to dozens of mares, it was only an afterthought, quickly forgotten. Hers might have been too, if not for a chance meeting in the market. They accidentally bumped shoulders beside a jeweller's store. A heavy crowd filled the square with noise. Hundreds of ponies bustled and shoved, perusing wares and haggling with steely-eyed merchants. Competition for the best goods was always fierce at the Canterlot Bazaar in the waning days of summer. They eyed each other in the afternoon's fading light, the jeweller and his goods momentarily forgotten.
I beg your pardon,
he said, after a pause. She gave him a demure smile, batting her long lashes at him. Was she flirting? No, of course not. Not with him.
Oh, think nothing of it,
she said.
Just a harmless touch.
He returned the smile, and they both returned to the display of gems. Hundreds of precious and semi-precious stones awaited their scrutiny. Rubies and emeralds sat upon cushions of royal velvet. Topaz and garnets crowded together in trays, like commoners.
This one is rather fine, she said,
pointing at a large ocean sapphire with her horn. Hints of midnight blue floated within its depths.
Regal, a fitting centerpiece for a lady's dress.
He glanced down at her coat.
Too rich for some complexions, I think. Gems should not distract the eye from the bearer.
She laughed, and it was the sound of bells.
You have a good eye. Not many ponies grasp colors so easily. But tell me, might it not work better with this?
Her horn glowed a faint silver, and yards of fine cloth emerged from her saddlebags. The fabric, in a dozen shades of indigo, twisted and shaped itself according to her will, until a rough semblance of a gown hung between them. The ocean sapphire lifted from its cushion and drifted towards the dress, coming to a rest as though it were a clasp upon its neck. He stared, mouth gaping, at her creation. Around them a dozen ponies paused their business, whispering and pointing at the magical display. She preened at the attention. Eventually, he recovered.
That's...
He trailed off and cleared his throat.
My lady, I apologize. That is quite the centerpiece.
The dress unravelled and returned to her saddlebags. The gem floated back to its perch on the merchant's counter. She graced him again with her smile, then turned without a word and vanished into the crowd. The merchant chuckled quietly at the stunned expression on his face.
Easy, son,
he said.
You're not the first pony to wear that look after meeting her. Save yourself the heartache and look elsewhere.
He took a shaky breath. Her scent, a delicate lilac, haunted him.
Who? Tell me, sir. Who was that mare? How could I have wandered these streets all these years and never seen her beauty? How could a star such as her lie glimmering in the dust, never to be noticed? What is her name?
That was Rarity, and only once a month does she grace our humble market. Each time she leaves another trail of broken hearts. Forget you saw her, son.
I could sooner forget my own name. No, I will not forget her. I will catch her eye, and then her heart.
The jeweler sighed.
Do you know how often I've heard those words? She has sworn to only give her heart to an artist as gifted as she. What you saw there was nothing compared to the masterpieces she creates.
An artist?
His heart soared.
Don't you see? This is fate, finally giving me a chance to earn true love.
The merchant shook his head.
Beware this path. She is beautiful, yes, but she can be cruel as well. Fail her test, and she won't hesitate to tear your heart to pieces.
But the glassblower was blinded. Her beauty, her skill, her charm, all danced within his mind.
Good sir, I appreciate your warnings, but I promise she has never met an artist such as I. I will craft her a work of glass unlike any seen in this world. After I win her heart, poets will write about our love for centuries to come.
It was not her beauty that attracted him. It was her grace. That night, he cleared every scrap of glass from his workbench. He abandoned every project. Baubles, ornaments, cups and vases, all were swept aside to make space for his new dream. He emptied the sand from his furnace to prevent any impurities from tainting his work. He drew and discarded a dozen ideas, each more elaborate than the last, searching for the one design that could win Rarity's heart.
A bird.
He mumbled as he worked.
A hummingbird. What else could do her beauty justice? It will have wings as graceful as her mane, a beak as sharp as her horn, crimson-breasted and azure plumage thatched.
The first week, he drew as the full moon fell half in shadow. Dozens of plans for a delicate glass hummingbird filled his shelves. Some perched atop glass twigs, while others hung suspended from glass threads no thicker than a spider's line of silk. He drew a hatchling breaking free from a glass egg, but he realized that newborn hummingbirds were rather sickly and not pleasing to the eye. Finally, inspiration struck in the form of a hummingbird drinking nectar from a glass flower. For a full day he drew plans for the perfect bloom, a delicate orchid the same amethyst hue as her mane. It hung from a twisting crystal vine tinted a pale green. Each petal would have to be individually forged and fused together to form the whole. The second week, as the shrinking moon became a sliver against the night sky, he gathered his materials. He spent hours sifting sand, sorting out the purest grains and grinding them into a powder with his pestle. He scoured the markets for additives, purchasing packets of antimony, cobalt, sulfur, and gold. Every one of his cutting tools he replaced, lest some dull edge mar or chip his precious creation. His apprentices complained at first, as he refused to let them help with his new project. This was too delicate, too important to leave in the hooves of those just beginning to learn their craft. Instead, he let them run his store, selling pre-made glassworks and taking orders for future delivery. He even let them create their own simple works in his forge, while he continued his preparations. The third week, he crafted the orchid's flowing petals and long, slender leaves. He heated his forge thousands of degrees, and used its hellish flames to melt sand into a thick puddle. The molten glass, yellow and brighter than a star, slowly cooled, but before it became too thick, he inserted a long metal pipe into its center. The glob of glass stuck to the pipe as he pulled it from the forge, and as its color deepened into yellow and orange, he blew into the free end of the metal tube. The soft glass expanded like a balloon. The hollow sphere it formed was nearly uniform. Thinner spots, where the glass had expanded too rapidly, cooled faster than the rest, and subsequently became stiffer and more resistant to further expansion. The result, after a few minutes of blowing and spinning the pipe, was a perfect globe of paper-thin glass, as clear as water, with a light green tint from the copper he had added to the mix. He knocked on the tube with a hammer, snapping it off the sphere, and used a diamond-edged chisel to score the glass into a dozen different patterns, all imitating the shape of a leaf. Once he was happy with 3 of them, he tapped the sphere with his hoof, and the whole thing broke apart. He picked out the pieces shaped like leaves, and promptly dropped them back into the forge. Rather than let the leaves melt entirely, he pulled them out as soon as they started to glow a faint cherry red. With the help of a pair of pliers, he gently twisted them into graceful, curved shapes, strikingly similar to those of real leaves. But there was still more to do. The leaves went back into the forge. When they were hot again, he pulled them out and carefully traced a series of veins on their surface. He pressed them against a woodblock, transferring the faint grain of the oak onto them. Finally, he ground their still sharp edges with a fine stone until they were as smooth as any leaf found in the forest. He inspected them, noting the parts he had crafted well, but also the tiny flaws always present in any new creation. Satisfied with his work, he smashed them beneath his hoof, swept the shards into the forge, and began the whole process again. 2 days, and 19 repetitions later, he had 3 leaves that might, just might, be perfect. It was a good start.
This seems like a lot of effort for a pony who doesn't even know your name.
She doesn't know it yet, Styx,
the glass-blower said. His friend, a fellow earth pony, with a marionette cutie mark on his flank, had joined him for dinner, and afterward the 2 of them repaired to the glass workshop to see his master work. Dozens of tiny glass leaves, petals, wings, and other bird fragments lay neatly ordered on his bench, waiting for the final bit of fusing that would bring them together as a whole. Styx reached a careful hoof toward one of the glass petals, a languidly folded purple shape that, were it not ever so slightly transparent, might well have been real. It glimmered in the dim light of the workshop, and his breath collected on its surface as he leaned in to inspect it.
This is amazing,
Styx said.
You're just going to give this to her? You don't even know her.
I don't need to know her.
The glassblower lit his torch, a tiny gas burner that shot an inch-long spear of blue flame from its tip.
She's perfect, Styx. If you saw her, you'd understand.
He put the orchid's stem in a leather-padded vise and began heating the tip of one of the leaves until it glowed a faint orange. The tip sagged slightly under its own weight, and he pressed it against the stem, allowing it to cool and harden in place. Styx rolled his eyes.
Sure. Don't you think she gets a dozen offers like this every time she visits Canterlot?
The glassblower fused another glass leaf onto the stem before answering. A tiny curl of smoke drifted up from the hot glass, all that remained of a speck of dust that had drifted too close and had been incinerated by the latent heat.
A dozen offers like this?
He gave his creation a critical eye. Styx watched in silence as the glassblower assembled the flower. The glass petals all fit together like the pieces of a jigsaw, as if he had measured their shape to within microns.
Well, perhaps not like that.
He allowed.
I've never seen glasswork so beautiful. I thought only unicorns could make things like this.
The finished flower was like a jewel. The polished glass shone with an inner light that drew the eye. Its emerald stem and leaves flowed like water across the table. It glowed with all the hues of night.
Unicorns have their magic,
The glassblower said quietly.
but theirs is not the only magic in the world.
He carefully fused the hummingbird's wings to its body. To the azure head he attached a pair of black gems for eyes. Finally, he attached its beak, a tiny sliver of orange glass sharper than a needle. The bird looked ready to take flight. Nearly 1,000 tiny feathers had been carved onto its wings.
This is my magic, Styx.
He picked up the glass hummingbird in his mouth and set it down beside the flower. Styx opened his mouth to congratulate his friend when a tiny flicker of movement stopped him. He blinked and leaned forward to inspect the sculpture more closely. The glass leaves trembled as he exhaled. He pulled his head back, startled, and gave the glassblower a questioning glance. His friend simply smiled and gestured back to the sculpture with his hoof. Clear glass beads, sparkling like morning dew, ran down the stem and dripped onto the workbench with a quiet tinkle. The flower twisted on its vine, petals opening, as it sought the sun.
How?
His voice trailed off as the hummingbird began to move. Its glass wings flapped stiffly, slowly at first, then so fast they blurred into nothingness. With a quiet click, it lifted from the table and hovered over the flower, drinking from the jewel as though both were alive.
This is my magic.
The glassblower said again. His friends stared at the living sculpture long into the night. Lacking any other clever ideas for how to present the glass flower, they simply wrapped it around a branch taken from the woods outside Canterlot. The glass stem grew tiny tendrils along its length and dug into the soft wood as though preparing to climb it, like a vine. The hummingbird darted around them as they worked, occasionally coming to rest near the flower when they paused. The Canterlot Bazaar started later in the morning than usual. The chill that filled the air slowly dissipated as the rising sun chased away the night. The changing of the seasons was on the merchants' lips as they set out their wares for the busy day to come. The glassblower and his friend waited near the fabric sellers, assuming that Rarity would stop there sooner rather than later. They spent the early hours chatting with the merchants. Styx kept the branch and flower hidden beneath a cloth in a simple woven basket. The glass hummingbird perched on the handle, motionless, and only drew an occasional glance from passers-by. Noon rolled around with no sign of Rarity. The glassblower tapped his hooves nervously. Styx rolled his eyes at his friend's impatience.
It's still early. She probably gets lunch first, then comes here to shop.
What if she doesn't, though? What if she went to some other market this month?
Then you sell this thing for a fortune and retire.
Styx leaned down to stare at the hummingbird. It buzzed its glass wings, spraying sunlight like a kaleidoscope.
Seriously, do you know how much a noble would pay for this?
The glassblower snorted.
I might as well sell my soul. The craftsmanship may be perfect, but the magic comes from love.
Right, love. For this mare you've met once, who doesn't even know your name.
Fine. Think of it this way, then. Of the hundreds of puppets you've made, which is your favorite?
Styx was silent for a moment. He rubbed his chin with a hoof.
Well, the one I made to complete my apprenticeship, I suppose. I spent months on it. Years, really, if you count all the studying and practice that went into it.
The glassblower nodded.
And where is that puppet now?
Over my hearth? You've seen it a dozen times, at least.
I have. And would you ever sell it?
Styx glanced down at the hummingbird. It looked up at him curiously, as if awaiting an answer to the question as well. He sighed.
Of course not. I love that thing.
Are you sure? I'm sure a noble would pay good coin for it.
Point taken.
Styx kicked at the basket lightly, sending the hummingbird buzzing into the air. It flitted around the nearby stalls, hovering over the colourful fabrics before returning to the handle. The nearby merchants stared at it with wide eyes. Another hour passed while they waited. Merchants and shoppers stopped to gaze at the bird, eventually forming a small crowd. The glassblower brushed off attempts at conversation, letting Styx answer their questions as best he could. Finally, just as the glassblower was wondering if the day was wasted, the crowd around them parted, revealing a white unicorn with a surprised look on her face. She glanced around the crowd, puzzled by their reactions, then turned her attention to the glassblower. His breath caught in his chest. She was even more lovely than he remembered. He could have stared at her all day. He would have stared at her all day, had Styx not jabbed him in the side with a hoof. The crowd mumbled quietly, some pennies laughing as he jumped. Fortunately, he recovered his train of thought before making too great a fool of himself.
Lady Rarity,
He said, stepping towards her. She leaned back, her eyes wide.
for this past month I have laboured at a work of art fitting for a mare of your beauty, a masterpiece worthy of...
Sorry. Who are you?
His planned speech tumbled to a halt. A faint well of panic began building in his heart.
I'm just a simple glassblower.
She frowned slightly, and he hastily added,
An artist like yourself. We met here last month at a jeweller's stand.
Did we?
she said, slowly.
I'm afraid I meet many ponies every month.
Yes,
He said.
yes. We spoke about a beautiful gem, and you crafted a delightful dress for it from thin air with your magic.
She tilted her head in thought.
Yes, I suppose that does sound like something I would do.
He smiled eagerly, his head bouncing.
Yes, and I have crafted something equally beautiful for you.
He pressed his nose against the basket and slid it across the stones to her feet. She looked at it curiously for a long moment. The hummingbird sat frozen on the handle, as still as glass. The crowd pressed forward, tightening the circle around the two of them.
That is an exquisite bird.
She finally admitted.
And very clever, having it perch on a hand like that. Oh, it shows some talent.
Her horn glowed, and the cloth in the basket parted, revealing the glass orchid wrapped around its branch.
Aha!
She said. The branch glowed faintly and lifted from the basket to hover before her. She gave him a patronizing smile.
Now this is fine work as well. You did this all for me? I am flattered. Just look at this detail. How did you manage to wrap it around this branch? I could have sworn that was...
Her voice trailed off into silence as she closely inspected the flower. The glass leaves swayed in the faint afternoon breeze. The crystal flower swung freely on its vine, brilliant and ripe with colour. A murmur rose from the crowd as they saw his masterpiece in full for the first time. Rarity's mouth hung open as she turned the branch. Her eyes widened as the hummingbird lifted from the basket and darted around her before coming to a rest on the flower. The branch trembled for a moment as the glow around her horn faltered. but she recovered her grip before it crashed to the hard stones below. Her lips moved, though no sound emerged. She stared at the living glass for what felt like an eternity to the glassblower before turning to him. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears.
You made this?
She whispered. He could barely hear her over the crowd.
I did.
He whispered. He could tell his triumph was near. Any moment now she would pledge her love for him. He wanted to speak, but didn't trust his voice just yet.
It's magical,
she continued.
I never dreamed of anything like this. It's so wonderful.
She trailed off again, this time with a look of concern on her face. Her eyes widened and darted back and forth between him and his creation.
Is it enough?
He asked, taking a step forward.
Have I passed your test?
She took a quick step back. He was too enamored to notice. She stammered, her gaze dancing around the crowd before briefly coming to rest on his forehead.
But you're not a...
She stopped herself before she could finish the thought. He didn't notice. She swallowed, collected herself, and spoke again.
This craftsmanship is unmatched, certainly.
She gently floated the branch back into the basket.
This is a good effort, but my art is not only well crafted, but useful. Does this flower attract suitors at a ball? Does it keep the bearer warm?
Her question was like a punch to the gut. He reeled slightly as he realized she was rejecting him.
But you said it was beautiful,
he said quietly. He felt his jaw begin to tremble. She cleared her throat daintily. Her head rose, and a more confident note entered her voice.
I said it was well crafted, but you have yet to meet my challenge. Try again, if you think your art is worthy.
She gave him a respectful but shallow nod, then turned and vanished back into the crowd. The first week, as the sting of Rarity's rejection flowed like poison through him, he drew. His apprentices offered a few suggestions, but mostly they were as baffled as he. What sort of glasswork would a lady find useful as well as beautiful? They went through a dozen ideas. A telescope, a jewellery case, a pair of reading glasses, hairpins. He drew plans for them all, and discarded them just as quickly. None were perfect. When the answer finally occurred to him, he sat, dumbstruck. Only after his apprentices splashed him with a bucket of water did he come to his senses. He rushed to his drawing board to put his plan to paper before it could escape him. In retrospect, it was obvious. Rarity was a beautiful pony. And what was more beautiful than her mane? And what did mares with beautiful hair need? A comb, of course. It would be large. Half its length would be the handle, the rest a fine-toothed comb suitable for teasing and styling a lady's mane. He considered several models for frame, and settled on a lean jaguar, its tail the handle, its body gently cradling the comb's teeth. White glass, he decided, with tiny rubies for eyes, and a light silver filigree along its spine. The second week, as the pain of rejection faded and was replaced by a cautious hope, he gathered his materials. The glass itself was easy enough. He kept a ready supply of tin to create milk glass for his shop. He had enough silver left over from an old project for the filigree, and the ruby eyes only took a quick trip to a local gem vendor. The handle caused him the most trouble. Pure glass, while appealing from a minimalist perspective, was insufficient for his purpose. The comb needed something physical to bind the attributes he was planning. It needed more. It needed to be perfect. A wire wrap of two metals, woven together, would do the trick. Gold, untarnishing, would represent beauty and its endurance through the ages. 1,000 years after he and Rarity and the kingdom of Equestria were gone into dust, the gold wrap on the comb would still shine as bright as the day he had presented it to her. To represent her magic, he needed a second element, one that was hard to find and ruinously expensive. 15 grams of meteoric iron, harvested from a fallen star and drawn into a hair-thin wire. It cost him more than he made in a normal month in his glass shop. The third week, he crafted the comb. It required fewer pieces than the hummingbird, with its separate flower and leaves and stem and petals. The whole comb started and ended as a single ingot of molten glass, mixed with a pinch of tin powder for a pure white colour. He let it cool in one of his forge's chambers, then slowly rolled it into a rod a foot long, thicker along half its length. He shaped the handle first, giving it a slight curve and a gentle plumb at its end. The rest of the cat's form he roughed out in the still soft glass. He poked a series of holes in the tail to anchor the wire wrap. Satisfied that he had the general shape correct, he slid the frame back into the forge for the first of many times. For the rest of the week, he crafted the comb's 100 teeth. After a few minutes in the forge, it was soft enough for him to use a pair of hardened steel pliers to pinch an edge of the glass frame and pull it into a slender spike. With a bit of practice, he was able to get each tooth the exact same length and shape, with only a minimum of correcting necessary. Once all 100 teeth were done, he spent a full day perfecting them. They were dangerously sharp, and he blunted their tips slightly to prevent unexpected injuries. He used a polishing board as thin as paper and fine as silk to smooth them to perfection. Finally, the frame and teeth were complete. He sent it one more time into a special, cooler chamber in his forge, only slightly over 1,000 degrees. When the glass began to glow, but long before it began to soften, he pulled it out and let it temper in the warm air of his workshop. He set the comb on his table beside a hammer and inspected his work critically. Although time was running out before Rarity's next visit, nothing less than perfection was acceptable, and he would not hesitate to smash the frame to pieces in response to a single flaw. Every tooth was perfect. The frame was elegant, elaborate, and flawless. The tail, though still bare, made for a perfect handle. He put the hammer away in its drawer.
So you really think you have a chance?
Styx asked. He had visited several times during the past month, but this was the first time the glassblower hadn't chased him away for disturbing his work.
What do you mean?
The glassblower mumbled. He held a spool of gold wire in his teeth, and was carefully measuring out a hoof's length of the metal to begin wrapping the handle. The smaller spool of iron sat beside him, waiting for its turn.
Well, she did turn you down in front of everyone. I thought you'd spend the whole month in mourning, but here you are, ready to try again.
The glassblower set the gold spool down. He put the comb in a vise, and carefully threaded the end of the gold wire through one of the needle-thin holes in the handle. For a while, there was silence as he wrapped the handle in the first layer of wire.
She seemed impressed with the hummingbird,
he said. Behind him, on a shelf, the glass flower rustled as though in a breeze. The hummingbird spent most of its time outside, sipping from flowers in its neighbors' gardens and confusing their cats.
She said it was perfectly crafted, just not useful. This will meet her standards, I think.
Seems a bit fragile. Won't those teeth break the moment she touches them?
The glassblower shook his head.
It's tempered. You'd need to hit it fairly hard to break it.
He rapped the teeth with his hoof to demonstrate the resilience. They were quiet while he worked. When the handle was fully wrapped in a layer of gold wire, he set the spool down and reached for the meteoric iron. Fastening the free end in another hole, he began wrapping the handle again, this time in a wider pattern that allowed the gold beneath to show through. Styx broke the silence.
It's just... I don't want you to get hurt.
What do you mean? Tomorrow's going to go perfectly.
Or she'll reject you again. I don't know how much you can trust her.
The glassblower glanced up at his friend.
What does that mean? Are you calling her a liar?
Styx held up a hoof.
No, I'm just saying... Look, I don't want you to get hurt tomorrow is all.
And I said tomorrow will go fine.
He turned and removed the finished comb from the vise and set it on his workbench. It glowed like a pearl in the dim light.
Look at it. It's everything she asked for.
Styx leaned over the comb carefully, as though expecting it to leap up and bite him at any moment. It remained still as a stone. Finally, he frowned and gave his friend a questioning glance.
That's it? It doesn't move or anything?
The glassblower chuckled.
There is more than one type of magic, Styx. The hummingbird wasn't enough for her, but this will be.
They waited by the jeweller's stands for her, in the same place as the previous month. A small crowd quickly gathered, eager to see what treasure the glassblower would present to her this time. More than a few noble ponies watched from the edges or chatted quietly with the gem merchants, making sure to keep an eye on the pair. The crisp air of the late fall was filled with excited conversations. Rarity did not keep them waiting long. She arrived an hour after the sun's late rising and walked directly through the crowd towards them. The sea of ponies parted for her and closed into a circle around them once she had passed. Styx shifted nervously from hoof to hoof, eyeing the crowd around them. The large velvet jewelry box, hanging from his mouth by a thin ribbon, was already the object of more attention than he was comfortable with. The glassblower, by contrast, was calm. A small smile rested on his lips and grew as Rarity approached.
Lady Rarity, you said my glass was perfectly crafted, but lacked utility. This month, I hope to meet your challenge with artwork as beautiful as it is functional.
He nodded to Styx, who set the velvet box on the cobblestones and pushed it towards her. She stared at the box for a moment. Those in the crowd closest to her saw the faintest tremor in her hoof as she reached out and lifted the lid. The comb rested on a plush velvet cushion, white and bright as the moon. All 100 teeth glinted in the sunlight, looking like dozens of perfect needles lined up in a row. The gold wire, half hidden beneath the dark grey overwrap, seemed to glow with its own light. The comb rested on a plush velvet cushion, white and bright as the moon. All 100 teeth glinted in the sunlight, looking like dozens of perfect needles lined up in a row. The gold wire, half hidden beneath the dark grey overwrap, seemed to glow with its own light. The market filled with a loud, excited murmur. She stared a while at his work, nostrils flaring. Finally, she lifted it with her magic and inspected it with a critical eye.
It is well crafted,
she allowed. Laughter drifted from the crowd, which she ignored.
Very well crafted, but it is just a comb. I have dozens like it.
The glassblower shook his head.
Try it.
He suggested. She sighed and trotted over to the nearest jewellery merchant. Like all such stalls, it had a large mirror for potential buyers to use when trying on new baubles. She adjusted the mirror, spent a long moment gazing at herself in it, then carefully pulled the comb through her mane. The results were immediate. Although Rarity's mane was already styled, the comb made it perfect. It grew fuller and thicker. Stray hairs evaporated like mist. Its purple hue deepened, becoming more vibrant. Each strand shone like a jewel in the sun, and cast indigo reflections on her alabaster coat. Rarity stared into the mirror with a blank expression on her face. The silver light around her horn faltered and faded, and the comb fell to the ground with a quiet tinkle that broke the silence. The glassblower trotted over, picked it up in his mouth, and set it on the counter beside the mirror. There was not a scratch on its polished surface. The glassblower stood beside her, both of them gazing in the mirror. Eventually, he leaned down to her ear.
I think you are beautiful enough, even without the comb,
he whispered. The crowd around them began to buzz again. The noble ponies pressed closer, trying to see the comb for themselves.
I don't care what your mane looks like, or whether your coat is flawless or smooth. There are 1,000 beautiful ponies in Canterlot, with riches and power and fame. None of them love their art like you. None of them would challenge the world like you. None of them have your beauty within.
She stepped away and drew a shuddering breath. Her eyes, as before, fixated on his forehead, where a unicorn's horn should be. He stared back, unperturbed.
This isn't fair.
She trailed off.
That is... I mean...
She shook as words failed her. He reached out to steady her, but she danced away with sudden grace.
Not yet,
she said.
You have shown craftsmanship and utility, but there is more to art than those. True art is timeless. The great works of history are as renowned today as they were when Princess Celestia was young. Craft me a work that will be celebrated for generations, and you will have my heart.
Last month, her rejection had stung him. Now, he smiled. She was within his grasp.